Welcome also once more from my side, René Mauer, Professor for Entrepreneurship and Innovation here on the Berlin campus. And to all of you, alumni, current participants, let me repeat that as of basically this period, also part of the bigger SAY Institute for Entrepreneurship, an institution that wasn't there when we were talking to you guys last year. Right, so this is actually another innovation. ESCP Europe having decided to create an entrepreneurship department. By that, just as Andreas just said, strengthening and underlining the importance of entrepreneurship and innovation-related activity. Not only, but also on the Berlin campus. And in that sense, also very happy that we're growing our activities. And by we're growing our activities, I mean that you are growing our joint activities. Because if you wouldn't follow our invitation to travel all this long distance into the far west end of the city, right? That wouldn't be possible. So I appreciate you coming from far and near, joining us now as participants of, for example, the newest cohort of the MDeal, the MDeal 2018-19. Make a little bit of noise right now, guys. MDeals. Welcome also the U School 2018. Make some noise, you guys, please, right now, right there. And also all the alumni who are joining us from previous cohorts. Now you guys make some noise. Either MDeal or U School. So welcome here. We also are having more guests who are supposed to come around because within the SAY Institute for Entrepreneurship, we have kind of put out 3 areas of excellence, 3 key points that we want to put forth. And you, the ones who have gone through the programs, and some of the people who are now going through the programs may have seen a glimpse of that. One is we want to, put to the front our knowledge, our expertise in terms of entrepreneurial methods. And we don't only want to do that in terms of what these methods are, also how they're interlinked, what kind of effects they can bring about, and particularly, and that may be a particular important point now that some of you just went through Improbable, that we're also big about the pedagogy around that. So we also do lots of work in terms of figuring out what the didactic means are to convey these methods. 1 point. 2nd point, we do understand entrepreneurship, yes, as building startups, and yes, we still don't mind if you create those that actually go to IPO and become insanely rich and then fund a couple of more professorships and institutes at the school. That's totally fine with us, but we also understand entrepreneurship beyond the startup sphere. We understand it as a phenomenon important for the corporate world, the greater business world, social initiative, social entrepreneurship, and even talking about that beyond business. So any kind of value creation that has to deal with uncertainty in the process of value creation is something that we're interested in, looking at it through an entrepreneurial innovation lens. And last but not least, we are very interested in ecosystems. We're embedded, due to our structure as a multi-campus business school, in different ecosystems. We're trying to understand what this embedding actually means. And we're also trying to do more and more of interconnecting these ecosystems, which I think is particularly important for a continent like Europe, still a little bit scattered and fragmented as countries, cultures, business contexts, regulations. And for the people who are starting a business in Berlin, or in Paris, or in Torino, or in Madrid, or in London, they may actually want to spread out, internationalize. And there we also want to offer help and answers and help these people actually through our interconnections between the ecosystems. So that's also our topic today, ecosystems, very heavily in at least one group who also joined us, a group from the area and the region of Lusatia, the Lausitz, very close by. And even there we are trying to get into conversations around what ecosystems can mean, what kind of value they can bring about, and how you actually get an entrepreneurial innovation infusion into creating this ecosystem that may be important there. And for that we are very lucky and happy to also have a particular guest today, which is Jack Fuchs. Welcome, Jack Fuchs, joining us today. Joining us today from California, I heard him say in the morning that it's actually the exact same weather in California. And we told him it's the exact same thing in Berlin in April every year. Just this weather. That was the first piece. So joining us from Stanford University, he's a lecturer there. He's also a very active VC, investor in companies. And luckily, he's not only doing that in the States, but also in Europe. Actually, primarily, maybe, well, to some extent, for sure, in Europe. So he's also interested in, our surroundings, our context, and our ecosystem. And I'm very happy, very, very happy, because the last interaction with an important person from the Silicon Valley was about a year or a year and a half ago, and it was when Mark Zuckerberg was visiting the city, and I remember that a social entrepreneur who was connected to us actually was asked to talk to Mark Zuckerberg, so to an important person from the Silicon Valley. And I think that that woman later on disclosed to us that she needed to go through a 2-week psychological preparation, to be prepared to talk to Mr. Zuckerberg. Because obviously the fact was it was scheduled to have a 7-minute interaction with him, and she shouldn't be too frustrated if it was just dropping down to 1 minute and a half. And she should be able to cope with that psychologically and so forth. I'm extremely happy that I did not have to go to any kind of training, psychological preparation. Yes. I appreciate that. And Jack also kind of promised to share a couple of thoughts with us today with his experience in Silicon Valley, but also the activities that he's doing in Europe, maybe even a little bit beyond 7 minutes, which was that boundary of Mark Zuckerberg. So giving him another hand of applause. So let's welcome him, and we're looking forward to your insights, Jack.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Andreas. Thank you, Renee, for that introduction. I appreciate very much the chance to share a perspective from Silicon Valley. And I don't want it to be the perspective. This is just my perspective. Take it, do with it what you will, submitted for your consideration. I do have a good amount of experience in Silicon Valley. Right now, I focus my time and attention on teaching, mentorship, advising. I sit on boards of directors of private companies. I do a little bit of work as a part-time CFO, and mostly what I love to do is help great entrepreneurs achieve great things all around the world. And so I'm taking my teaching that I do at Stanford and the mentorship and advice that I give to US companies, and I bring that to Europe and Latin America and Asia. And as such, I've been helping out ESCP for a little while, and I hope to help out more and more at multiple locations throughout Europe. So I shared with the group this morning that everybody thinks of Silicon Valley as being this ideal place for innovation and for entrepreneurship. And I have 4 Ps. People, pennies, process, and philosophy are the reasons that people cite as Silicon Valley being incredible. We have people who are willing to work for almost no salary, just for snacks. We feed them 3 meals a day so that they stay working long hours. We have deep-pocketed investors who are willing to invest in anything, throwing millions and millions of dollars at people for almost no reason. We have university, Stanford, and other universities where a lot of technology can be licensed out. If you work at Stanford and you develop something, it is 100% that you will be able to out-license it and be able to form a company out of it if you would like to. And we have a philosophy of forgiveness, a philosophy of patience, actually, really. But if you fail in Silicon Valley, but you carry yourself well and you're ethical and you work really hard and you're reasonably smart, you will get another chance. Unlike many parts of the world, you can fail once, you can fail twice, and you'll still get a chance to do it again. Yes, Silicon Valley theoretically is that ideal place, but in actuality, it really is not that great. most of that is absolutely in the ideal, that's theoretical. And you folks are going to be much better served not in thinking I need to move to Silicon Valley to be able to get all that, but instead, how can I create the closest thing to what I just described, what Jack just described? How can I, the entrepreneur, create my own version of Silicon Valley wherever I am? And what you should think about is leveraging the global ecosystem, sourcing what you need where you need it. When you think about those 4 Ps, when you think about how wonderful your network is wherever you are, whether you're German or some other European or from somewhere else in the world, you have a group of people who probably would love to follow you and to be part of your team. You have some people who probably would like to invest in you in some way. You have, hopefully, enough perseverance to realize that you can source your developers in one place. You can open up a sales office in the United States if you need one. You can decide that you're going to be a European company or an American company or a global company or a German company. And it's totally up to you. You should source what you need, where you need it, and take advantage as an entrepreneur, creating that view of Silicon Valley wherever you are. And so wherever I go, I realize that there are lots and lots of advantages in different places for entrepreneurship. But I am from Stanford, and so I wanted to share one particular example of something that we do at Stanford. And I think it happens in other places around the world as well. But this is a particular kind of incubator or accelerator, and it's called StartX at Stanford. And anybody that has a Stanford affiliation can apply. If they get accepted, they get a small amount of money, a stipend, and they get they get mentorship, they get a working space, and they don't take any equity at all. If you are able to raise venture capital money, Stanford will invest up to 10% of whatever you raise from the venture community, but only if you want them to. But if you do, they will do it. So if you were able to raise $1 million, Stanford will also put in $100,000. That gives their stamp of approval to what you're doing, but it's only if you want to. I like that model because they're not really trying to make a business out of it. They're not trying to get wealthy in the short run. They're kind of trying to get wealthy in the long run, right? Because if those companies turn into Google, they'll be doing very well. So I wanted to share just a little bit of thinking about how I believe entrepreneurial companies should be evaluated. It's a framework that we use in Silicon Valley. I've been using it for almost 20 years. And the reason I have this framework is because I'm trying to find explosive growth companies. The whole idea of venture capital in Silicon Valley, the whole idea of Silicon Valley is to find the company that has this exponential curve, because disruptive technologies and entrepreneurship fuel that exponential growth, as opposed to most companies that grow kind of like that. The problem is that early on, it's hard to tell which is which. And you can probably guess that that is the same graph from before. I just extended it out the page, and you just don't know which is which. So I developed a very simple framework, and I like to share it. I like to share it with you. If and when we wind up going into some deeper dive, I'll go into a lot more detail about each one of these things. But there are 5 basic questions that I ask about any opportunity. So when someone approaches you later on at the barbecue and asks you and says, "Hey, I'm thinking of doing this. I want to do Tinder for pets," right? What I'd like you to do is I'd like you to think about this simple framework and ask these 5 questions and see whether you think it's a good idea or not. And those 5 questions are: is there a burning need? Is there a big enough market? Does the person have a scalable business model? Can he or she establish a sustainable, differentiated positioning? And is it the right team and the right time for the idea? Now, I'll go through each of these in more detail some other time, and with any of you who would like to talk to me about it, I'll stick around for the barbecue. But I'd like to just go into a little more detail on right team. One thing is, not all of you have the same risk tolerance. And in fact, different places around the world tend to have different risk tolerances. Silicon Valley is on one extreme. Perhaps Germany is somewhere in the middle. Some people think of Germany as being a little bit more conservative, but it's probably in the middle in terms of conservativeness. For example, in Brazil, if you lose investors' money, you can be put in jail. That would make people maybe even a little more risk-averse than you might be in Germany. As you're starting your company, or as you're thinking about an entrepreneurial idea, think about the level of market risk that you want to take and the level of technology risk that you want to take. I know we can build it, but will people buy it? That's the risk. Other companies have a high level of technology risk, but a low level of market risk. I'm not sure we can build it, but if we can, I know we can sell lots of them. People ask, what's the difference in different regions? What is entrepreneurship like in Boston or in New York or in Berlin? And what I would say is, in Berlin, there are a lot more of these kinds of ideas. A lot more consumer ideas on balance. In Munich, you'll find many more of these ideas that serve industry, that are difficult ideas to make, but if you make them, people will buy them. And then some ideas, some entrepreneurship, you really just want to suspend disbelief. It's like, I just want to do something that is so crazy, otherwise I don't want to bother. Other people, and this is actually 99.99% of entrepreneurs around the world, they're opening up restaurants or a tea shop or a rug store or right? I mean, or they have a small business. And there's not that much market risk. There's not that much technology risk. They just want to persevere and do it. And there's nothing wrong with any four of these things. With any one of these four, what's important for you is to know who you are, what kind of entrepreneur you are, what kind of risk environment you want to be in. How long is it going to take you and your investors to see the returns that you want? Another thing about you as an entrepreneur, I heard a talk by someone about passion, and I think passion is an extremely overused word. I haven't used it. In fact, I taught all day upstairs, and I never used the word. But there's something about, this is a little bit about passion that I think rings true. For those of you that want to think about being an entrepreneur, you don't have to be passionate about enterprise software, right? Or about process engineering, or about... Steve Jobs was not even passionate about, and he's the one who coined, follow your passion. Steve Jobs was not passionate about consumer product design when he started Apple. He was a college dropout. He was into Zen and into drug. He was passionate about drug culture. He was passionate about East Asian religions. But how you develop passion is by applying yourself relentlessly over a long period of time to something that you really enjoy doing. And that's what entrepreneurship, I think, is all about. It's also probably what life and career is about. And as you think about your pathway, for those of you that are just joining and coming in to MDill, for those of you who are leaving or who are thinking about their careers, what I really like for people to do, wherever they are right now, I want you to think about what your goal might be. Not all of you should have this goal. There aren't enough companies, there'd be too many companies in the world. But you should establish your own goal, realize where you are, and then realize that there are lots of different paths that you can take to that goal. It is very freeing. You don't need to start a company right away just because you came here and Renee wants you to donate another couple of buildings and a couple of professorships. You can go work for a big company first and get a better idea and then have a better chance of donating those buildings and donating those professorships. Or if you really have some incredible reason to start a company now, then by all means do that. And you'll learn a ton, you may be really successful, and it'll lead to better things afterwards. I wanted to leave one last major thought with you about how we in Silicon Valley think about value creation. And then I'll talk a little bit about some differences with Silicon Valley and other places, and then we'll close. And I'll take questions. The companies on the DAX create value, hopefully nice and linearly. Their value increases nicely as their earnings and revenue increase. The stock price goes up, and the stock price times the number of shares, that's the value of the company. That's the value of the enterprise. In small startup, private entrepreneurial companies, there is no market for the securities. There is no value in the open market. And value is not created in a nice, slow, linear fashion. Value is created in step function as risk in the company is reduced. When you do something that reduces the risk dramatically of the company's increases the chances of the company's success dramatically, you then increase the value of the company. And you do that by hitting product and market milestones. So what you wind up doing is you wind up proving that the product actually works, and then you can raise some capital. And then you go out and actually completely build the product and get real customers, and then you have de-risked the company dramatically. And by doing so, you've increased the value of the company dramatically, and you raise more money at a higher price. This is the way that Silicon Valley thinks about companies. The value is created by reducing risk, by meeting these very important product and market milestones. And we can talk more about that, but you can imagine this is sort of Series A, Series B, Series C, and then eventually you're valued based on your revenue and your earnings. So you should be, those of you that are thinking about raising money from outside investors, you want to take that money and you want to achieve something really big and measurable with it, like get the product to work and get customers. People ask about different entrepreneurial endeavors in different places, and I just use this as just an example. Outside of Silicon Valley, people tend to focus, and entrepreneurship tends to cluster, often because of the kinds of industry that's in that area, or the kind of city that it is. For example, in the United States, well, for example, in Finland, Nokia was huge in Helsinki, and even before it collapsed, it became a hotbed for communications and mobile companies, and Finland became an incredible entrepreneurial scene for that. Financial technology, fintech, and media. And I talked earlier about the differences between Berlin and Munich. In Munich, you tend to get more industrial and more medical companies. In Berlin, you tend to get more consumer-oriented companies. Berlin is just a bigger city. There are more consumers. It makes more sense. So I just put that up there. I'll be glad to talk to anybody who comes from other areas of the world or other areas of the country and talk more about what I see in the entrepreneurial scene in your area. The good news is that there really are a tremendous number of investors in Europe, and there's a tremendous number of investors in Europe who will invest in the late rounds once you're like in private equity land. Unfortunately, there's not a very good ecosystem in what we would call Series B. There's kind of this U-shaped curve in terms of funding availability in Europe. It's the same curve in the United States. Series B is hard in the United States too. It's just that the U isn't quite as low in the middle in the United States. And we can talk. There are a couple of firms that have just realized how bad this U is for Series B, and there actually are a couple of firms that have just started that are focusing just on Series B. So when the time comes, you can get in touch with me. And the way you would get in touch with me is through my email address, if you want to take a photo or jot it down. If you want to also talk to me at the barbecue, I'll be happy to share any other thoughts with you. And then if anybody has any questions now that are either germane to my talk or just any random question at all, I'd be delighted to take them.
Hi, Jack. I'm Joanne. Do you think Asian startup founders should try to get VC at Silicon Valley, or should they just stick to China or Singapore?
Venture capitalists very much like to invest in companies that are close to where they are. And the main reason is that they don't like to travel to board meetings. They won't tell you that, but that's the main reason. They will tell you that they want to make sure that they're able to help you, and they're right, and you're right there, and like they can't reach you by Skype, right? But they really. Also, sometimes they wonder if you're an Asian company and you come to the U.S., why don't the Asian investors like this? I don't know enough to go in there. So I recommend, whenever possible, to try to get investment where your company is planning on being headquartered and where you're planning on living, and ideally where your customers will probably be. But if you think you want to be a global company, and you think you might someday want to be headquartered in California or in the United States somewhere, realize that when you're forming your company, get very good legal advice, because you're going to potentially want to flip the company. You may headquarter the company in Singapore or in China initially, but want to change it and change the headquarters to the United States later on. If you decide you want to do that, you better have planned on that from the start. So then you might get Series A from Asia, and then you start getting Series B and Series C from the United States. And a lot of people wind up doing that. Sometimes you can do it without changing your headquarters.
Hi, Jack. We saw that after the financial crisis, governments are trying to revive the economy by putting more money into SMEs and startups. There's kind of a myriad of government subsidies over here in Europe. How is that in Silicon Valley? Is there a need for that?
Yes, so there has not been a need for that in Silicon Valley. There are specific instances of the United States government putting money into specific companies in different ways. Some of them have been successful, some of them have not been. It's a bit of a, I actually very much like some of the things that are going on in Europe right now. I very much appreciate tax-advantaged investing. Italy and France, depending on who's leading that year, they'll have like up to $75,000. If you invest in a startup company, you can write that off on your taxes. I think that's a fantastic way to foster angel investing. Another way that I like that's happening in Europe is where you'll have a venture fund, and the government will match dollars into the venture fund. So the venture fund is still making the decision about whether to invest in the company, but the payout to that venture fund is going to be better because the government is essentially subsidizing that investment. Those are great things. They don't happen in Silicon Valley. They don't need to happen in Silicon Valley. And what I don't like is when governments decide they are going to be the ones to decide where to put the money. That has happened in the US. It doesn't make that much sense to me.
Do you perceive that there are more female founders in the States or in Silicon Valley than in the rest of the world? And if so, why?
I don't perceive that there are more female founders anywhere. There are fewer in Europe than there are in the United States, but there aren't enough in the United States either. We work very hard in our courses at Stanford to have alumni that are women come and speak at our class, to have women venture capitalists on our panel of judges, and we struggle to make it even 30 or 40% representation, because it's about 20% at maximum for women. And part of that is that 20% of engineers are women. Engineering graduates are women. Now that's fundamentally changing, right? I mean, it's amazing. My college just had the majority of the engineers that graduated 2 years ago from my college were women. and still are women, to my knowledge. But there is a big gap, and it's a very important gap that's known at Stanford. I only have 1 or 2 of the companies that I advise. Only 1 or 2 of them are women founders out of about 12. Yeah, it's maybe slightly better, but it's not nearly as good as it should be. In terms of why, I think that one of the reasons is we got to produce more women engineers, because I think that really is the source of a lot of innovation. We need to continue to the sort of ecosystem that includes investors as well. There's also the same problem with women in venture capital, and that can, people tend to invest in people that kind of, that remind them of themselves maybe, right? So if you're a man is more likely to remind you of yourself. I mean, that's the kind of stuff that happens. This is all on tape, but that's my honest answer.
Thank you, Jack. How is the startup scene in the Trump era? What's happening, especially now that the markets are going into these extreme swings?
We were making a draw on who had to come up with that question.
Yes. So the 2 of my companies are in clean technology, and this has hurt them because all of the major truck and car companies were supposed to be headed in a really good direction, and the pressure has been taken off a bit, and so these companies are not it's not as great. The positive news is that California is becoming its own regulatory system, and almost something about 15 to 20 states, more like 15 I think, but follow California. And so when California puts something in place, the other states follow. And then now there's going to be a battle about that. But I think eventually that's going to all even out, and the companies, things are going to change in the next few years. In terms of the markets, the expectations in the United States are still that the markets are going to be extremely strong through the rest of this calendar year. As long as the markets are strong, the IPO market remains strong, and therefore investment in companies remains very strong. And so right now, Silicon Valley is investing full steam ahead, as though there's nothing strange going on that side of the country. What would change that is if this market instability turns into a true downturn. And I don't think anybody thinks that's going to happen at the moment, or the prevailing wisdom is that it's not going to happen at the moment. And Silicon Valley, everybody's pretty groupthinky, right? So if the prevailing wisdom pretty much rules. And I actually do agree with that. I'm usually a contrarian, but I actually agree that things are going to be relatively strong. This is all just, the trade war will not happen. That's my hope. But of course, I also thought Donald Trump would not get elected. So I've been wrong about other things.
Hi. You showed the slide in regard to the risk reduction and the willingness to invest, basically going against each other in trends, and mentioned that you thought that in Germany the angel capacity or willingness to invest is there. What about the actual ticket size? Basically, the products that are built on the same technology. Okay, people in Berlin might not make the same salaries as in the Silicon Valley, but I would tend to say that the product development cost is relatively similar. So what's your thought on why the tickets are so low, and how does that impact?
So your first question you answered implicitly, which is yes, the ticket sizes are lower in Europe, and therefore also the valuations then are lower. And so the ticket sizes are lower because the valuations are lower. And the valuations are lower because of the exits. So, and I don't know that investors really consciously think this way, but they sort of say, if I'm going to invest in this company in Series C, this is a company, let's say, has $20 million in revenue, and it's growing nicely, and they're going to raise a round of funding. Let's say they're going to raise $25 million. All right. to grow. They're thinking, well, if this company is successful, it can become a $50 to $75 million company. It could be sold to a company for $200 million. So they're going to say, okay, I want to get 2 to 3 times my money if the company is successful. And so they backcast and say, well, so therefore, I kind of want to invest $20 million at a $75 million valuation so that I can get 3 times my money. That same thing occurs each step back in the chain. And so because what I just said at the end, $200 million, in the United States, the IPO market is so much more available that it drives up the exit prices and the purchase prices of companies. And so the exit opportunity for that same company could be $500 million. And so when you backcast that all the way, you can afford to do a higher amount of seed funding at an effectively higher price. And each round can be higher and the valuations can be higher. And there's also the fact that there's less capital and the size of your fund matters. But it really is about the fact that it's all about those exits. And the same thing happens in the United States if the IPO market were to shut down and therefore companies wouldn't have to spend as much money if they were buying companies, you would see the check sizes not necessarily go all the way down to Europe size, but you would see all of those check sizes and all the valuations come down at all those other parts of the curve. And that's also why Series B is tough, but that's for later. Didn't want to.
A couple of minutes, you talked about board meetings, and what we experience very often is that when it comes to Series B or C, when investors invest really money, that the reporting obligations of the targets rises extremely. And so many startups actually fear that this takes too much time on reporting, which they lose on creativity and development. And this is especially the case when things don't work out the way the business plan told everybody it would, which is usually the case. So what's your advice on this, and how do you usually handle this?
So I think that's probably a function of, in Europe, a lot of the Series C investors are reformed late-stage private equity people. And they're kind of used to companies that are much more established. Because in the United States, Series B and Series C, the only difference is you wind up having an audit, a financial audit, which is fine. You just cordon that off. And they're usually reforming venture capitalists who now have such a big fund that they need to put a lot of money to work. So part of it is an alignment of investors. What I like to do, if possible, and it might be too late for you, is I like to manage that in the documentation of your Series B and your Series C. So they'll want to put in that you have to have audited financials by such and such a date and reviewed financials by such and such a date, and we want the forecast by this, and they'll put this kind of stuff in there. And I try to take it all out, or at the very least just do the annual audit. And I try very hard to negotiate that by using that language with what you just said, by telling that to them beforehand, before you've run into trouble, right? And so that it's not written into, so the expectations are written into the documentation so that they know what to expect, you know what to expect. And if they don't like it, unfortunately, you may need to say, okay, fine, but at least you can negotiate it beforehand so there's an understanding of what they can ask for. Secondly, because it's often ambiguous, it's also a sign of whether you are actually managing the board. Because most of the time, they're not even asking for something that was written in that's expected. They're just asking for some kind of reporting, and they don't actually have a right to it, but they're your board, and they can fire you if you don't give it to them, so you give it to them, right? You really want to be active in managing your board and helping them appreciate what they should be allowed to do and what they shouldn't be allowed to do. And if what they're asking for is effectively operational information, you say, no, that's what we have for management. You know, if you want to come in, I'll thumb through it with you and I'll talk you through it and I'll meet with you offline, but that's not a board matter and it's not an investor matter. As an investor, you don't have the right to it. As a board member, I'm happy to talk it through with you, but and ideally you set the stage for that before it starts to rain so that then when they ask that, you say, no, we don't give that. That's not for you. That's my deck. So anyway, that's the whole, it's about board management, board expectations, and you as the CEO, even if you're a first-time CEO, have a lot of power to manage that board. They do want to be led. You know, if they start talking about what color the product should be, and you say, this is just for information. The board doesn't tell us what kind of color to make the product. Thank you. And if you do that early on, you're teaching them to be actually board members and not second-guessing you as an operating company.
I actually have two questions. First question is, do you see a profitable market for businesses that are tackling social and environmental issues in the future? And the second question is more a personal one. What did you learn from R.J. Miller?
So was your first question that the market for social entrepreneurial opportunities, for social or environmentally based entrepreneurial opportunities? Right, and what is is there a market? Yes. Yeah. So I do like to have you'll have to fill me in later. I do like to have you're either a for-profit enterprise or a not-for-profit enterprise. I really do believe that you should be one or the other. And if you're a for-profit enterprise, absolutely part of your package of who you are as a company and who you are as a leader can be the social component of what you do, right? And you would attract investors who maybe appreciate that as well. Just as, for example, healthcare can be a little bit less good of an investment than other things, but people like investing in healthcare, right? Same would be true perhaps about things that are environmental or socially based, but they don't have to be. So you're either that kind of company where that's just a part of the entire marketing mix of who you are as a company, or you are a not-for-profit and you state that and you do that and you may have a product, but you're not actually looking for investment from venture folks. But absolutely, I mean, in the United States, there are an entire group of people that call themselves double bottom line investors, one of which is called DBL, which stands for double bottom line. And then the other question is, I don't have to answer because there was only one more question, right? And so you have to ask me at the barbecue. No, I did not actually study with R.J. Miller. He passed away before I got to Stanford Business School. I will say, though, that I did get to work with a gentleman named Marvin Bauer, who was really the guy who founded McKinsey & Company. And he was 95-ish years old when I got to work with him. And I learned an amazing amount from him. I do think that very much the kind of person you are as someone who founds a company is it reflects on the company that you have. And you say what you will about McKinsey and what you think of it, positive and negative, but for the first 50 years of its existence or 60 years of its existence, that gentleman and what he did, and I'll talk to you at the barbecue if you'd like to know, but what he did and the way he carried himself and the way he ran the place and what he did when he stepped down from being the leader, everything that he did enabled that company and in fact that entire industry and probably PowerPoint. It enabled everything to exist that does in that entire thing. And I think if you are founding something, realize that who you are and what you're like really matters, and the company winds up as a reflection of you. Thank you for your question, and thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for being engaging in this conversation. It is a community event. That means we have more drinks, more food, outside, even fresh air right there. Remember that there are mentors running around with name tags where the name is underlined. hunt them down. This is the opportunity, this is the chance. It can be totally serendipity based, right? So just do chance encounters. They are usually the nicest ones, just as this one, because we had this kind of serendipity based chance encounter somewhere in Friedrichshain due to some other contact that was a mutual contact of us both. So stay with us, eat, drink, enjoy the company, have a good evening, and thank you for coming out here. Thanks to Jack. Thanks to you guys.